Ms. Cianfarani, you talked about Canada getting ghosted from AUKUS. And then you went on to talk about the NATO frame contracts that are out there right now on a number of different areas in Canada, again, is not part of that discussion, even though we're a member of NATO. Why are we being ghosted at NATO?
Well, I think it's that we've been in our behavior, and to some extent, from what I've seen reported in the newspapers, the Prime Minister has been very clear with our NATO allies that we have no intention of meeting the obligations that we've signed up to. And I believe that NATO allies have taken that in a very serious way, and their behavior accordingly is that Canada doesn't deserve or isn't going to be a reliable partner on the world stage. That they will take what we are willing to provide, put forward, but that if you need someone to rely upon to meet their commitments, that it isn't going to be Canada.
That is unfortunate. Appreciate your candor. We talk about the U.S. giving Canadian companies military contracts. We know that they often work quite differently than the government of Canada and how they approach it. The RFPs, as was mentioned, we need volumes of documents to satisfy the risk-adverse bureaucracy within the government of Canada, where down the States, 100 pages is usually more than enough, and they'll work side by side with industry to develop new military products. So I'm just wondering what experience Canadian companies are having working with U.S. military that we should be taking as lessons learned to apply to how we procure our own equipment here in Canada.
I think it's tough because we have, obviously different acquisition rules, and we have, I think, a sort of a narrative in our country that, we compete, fair, open competition, almost at any cost. That is not a mantra that most other countries have. Most other countries start from, as I said, a position of we will preference our domestic industry first and foremost, and then comes the conversation as how do we involve our partners and allies or other nations if we're going to be providing this equipment to the rest of the world. So, we would have to really, first and foremost, change the nature of the way in which we interact with our own industry from first principles. That being said, there are lessons you can learn from the Americans where, and the Australians to some extent, where even before they conceptualize what they're going to make or build or the next airframe, for example, they will already be working in side by side with their industry on what is in the art of the possible. And that becomes usually a research and development project, which then gets funded by firm contracts. So those are some ideas that we could, starting with perhaps our next generation of armored vehicle.
A year ago, the Chief of Defense Staff and Minister Anand said that we must prepare to be on a war footing. Has industry received any other further signals about war footing type procurement?
We have received signals from other nations.
Okay, so that statement was the only one that we got in Canada.
Yeah, we are not on a war footing.
Okay.
Our industry has not been put on a war footing, which you would do through firm government-backed contracts.
Okay, so when Canada was at war in Afghanistan, there were successful quick procurements for Chinook helicopters, Hercules aircraft, Globemasters, new Leopard tanks, new LAV upgrades. Is the issue of war footing, is that an expedient for procurement?
No, it is the issue that from the top on down, it was make this procurement happen. Okay. So it was a demand and a contract that followed, which procured the equipment that you're talking about.
Okay, so it's simply a matter of
if we want it to happen, it can happen. It will take time for the companies to ramp up to production volume. But if we want it to happen, we need to provide firm contracts for production ramp up.
I don't know if you heard the testimony that came up here, but we had the suggestion been made at this table that it's industry that is not ramping up or investing in production. and that there aren't long-term contracts available, despite 155 shells being in demand, not just to replenish our own supplies, not just to supply Ukraine, but by all other allied militaries. Can you, what can industry do to get shell production increased in Canada?
Industry is expecting to see demand signals which are firm, binding, signed contracts. These investments in production lines to ramp up will take capital investments that repay themselves in the order of 15 to 20 years, which means that they need to be backstopped by a procurement size that is large enough to effectively run the line for that long of a period of time in order for them to recuperate their investment. That's first and foremost. So signed, legally binding contracts.
So a year and a half into the conflict in Ukraine, and shell production has not gone up at all in Canada. We're the same as we were before. General Eyre it was very concerned about this and sounded the alarm. So why can't this happen? Is it a matter of the government making this a priority and putting the contracts out, or what will it take?
As I understand it, proposals have been put to the Government of Canada. I have not seen these proposals, but I do understand from companies, proposals have been put into the Government of Canada to increase shell production, to modify the lines, particularly for 155s. And to my knowledge, and you'd have to ask the company to confirm this, but to my knowledge, there have been no legally signed contracts to increase production so that we can deliver to Ukraine.
So industry is waiting for the government?
Of course it is.
Okay, thank you. On the, you had said that the exclusion of Canada from AUKUS is a symptom of the failure of Canada to take its national defense and its procurement as well seriously. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, it's an example of how Canada doesn't seem to be, I think, reading the tea leaves correctly. We went into AUKUS, as I understand it, expecting, or in the words of the Prime Minister, that this is a submarine deal, not understanding that allies speak through defense cooperation agreements, so that this is more than just a purchase of submarines. There is a whole technology stream going on behind this where the three nations will collaborate, the Brits, the UK, and the US will collaborate to produce emerging technologies much beyond a submarine deal.
And share intelligence amongst themselves without Canada being a part of it.
Well, we're not at the table.
Right. You said that eliminating bottlenecks is part of the key to fixing procurement. Can you identify some of those bottlenecks?
Well, first and foremost, we need to, before I go into hypothetical bottlenecks, we would need to map the system. Right now, there exists no mapping of the procurement system in the public domain anyway, which means that we cannot identify where there are bottlenecks, misalignments, or perhaps duplications to make determinations on how we would change that process.
So industry doesn't know how to best go about putting together a bid or a proposal because they don't even understand.
Well, no, we understand in general how the system works, but if you actually want to do the hard work of eliminating steps which make this overall process highly complicated, you would have to take, for example, you would have to be able to have exposure to, I don't know, the 250 some steps that the Department of National Defense goes through to get a project from project conception, requirements analysis, options analysis, and then through to actual procurement. We have no visibility into those things, so we can't conjecture as to how the system might be repaired or not.
Okay, and this is only when the Prime Minister makes this a priority will this happen? You talked about the importance of the Prime Minister. Is it the weight of the Prime Minister's office is just not behind?
We would expect to see something like this in mandate letters, and we would expect it to be very directive to the ministers in charge. There are effectively 3 ministers, but a few more that play within defense procurement and export, if you want. We would expect to see it in all of the 3 minister mandate letters to take action to reduce or to take action to have procurement reform, which maybe they need to go a little bit further to say meaningful procurement reform that reduces the number of steps and time that it takes from acquisition to from conception to acquisition.
Okay, so the actual goal there to reduce times is not stated in any of the as a priority by the government.
Not as far as I know.
It took 20 years after the cancellation of the first Sea King replacement order to get the helicopters in place, the Cyclones. So given that it took that long and that the Griffins, or the CH-146s, are due to be replaced in the 2030s, should we not be placing that order now?
Well, maybe I'll give a bit of an example on this, because again, it goes to your question and then also the previous question with respect to, isn't there a bit of a disconnect here on some of these things? But when the government puts in timelines, puts in key capacity, key capabilities, and puts in the funding, as we saw through the COVID-19 example, industry can do amazing things. And it's incumbent upon the government to set forward those priorities, absolutely.
Is there an order in place yet? Yes or no, to the best of your knowledge?
I won't talk about specific procurements.
Okay,
on
and with that, would it be an idea to have these key procurements put in the mandate letters of the ministers? Maybe that's what they're waiting to release.
I would say so. We're eagerly awaiting the defense policy update, and again, a clear signal from the government on funding, timelines, capacity, and capability, and then also for that industrial strategy. Absolutely key.
And Mr. Mueller, you were around here when we acquired the Chinooks and the C-130s, as well as the Globemasters. We got those in record time. What is it that we didn't do then that we are doing now, or vice versa? How did we get those so quickly when we needed them, yet it just drags on seemingly now?
Well, I think what's not happening now is we haven't identified the capacity, we haven't identified the capability. We have, in some respects, identified the budget and then the timelines. We need those ingredients all to come together, and then industry can respond in phenomenal ways. Again, I look at the COVID-19 pandemic. We had aerospace companies who had never made a ventilator before. The government gave those ingredients, and within a few months, we had ventilators. So industry can respond if that plan is in place, and it doesn't need to take a long time.
So to both of you, were you or your representatives of industry consulted on NORAD modernization needs? Were either of you consulted before the orders went in?
Not that I can recall.
We have had a very top-level briefing on some of the technology planks under NORAD modernization, but at this point, we have not been involved in the actual planning and preparations for the equipment that's going to be purchased for NORAD mod. Some of our companies may have been involved in some of the procurements of the North Warning systems, but you have to speak to them directly. So, certainly, we have not at the association level been given a big plan for all the rollout for NORAD mod.
But again, you have $38 billion, huge opportunities for Canadian industry. And we need support from the government to identify those opportunities to be able to chase them.
Okay, Ms. Cianfarani, we have 4 submarines in our Navy fleet, one of which we're lucky to have at sea at any given point in time. Are you aware of any actual procurements in place? Are they even looking for a replacement?
I can't speak to the operational needs in the Canadian Armed Forces. I am aware I understand, because I have not seen a copy of the Defense Policy Update, but I understand that this asset may be discussed in the Defense Policy Update. But I have not seen, I've not actually seen it.
Just want to keep on this track of DPU. How disappointing is it that the government hasn't come forward with it? There are at least 6 months behind on the release of DPU. How much do you think it's being influenced by the decision to cut $1 billion in spending from the defense budget? And of course, that's on top of $2.5 billion of lapsed spending last year, a total of $10 billion that's been lapsed under the defense policy the Liberals came up with 7 years ago. And that's to both of you.
Well, thank you for the question. As I said before, we are very concerned about the defense policy update not coming out, and it's a real opportunity for the government to signify defense as a priority for the country. And not only that, there's a huge opportunity for the defense policy update to also signify the need for an industrial strategy that's there. And again, I think Canada can play a role internationally. We need to step up. And I think the real question is, are we going to take that leadership role or not? And currently, I don't see defense as a priority right now.
So, Ms. Cianfarani, when you take the lack of having a DPU, when you take that there's an absence of a ministerial mandate letter to our new Defense Minister, Bill Blair, what does that say about the priorities of this government when it comes down to defense procurement?
I think what it says is that Canadians don't prioritize national security in the way other countries do. That is the single biggest conclusion that I can draw from the state of defense, both procurement and the Canadian Armed Forces.
So you had mentioned earlier the use of national security exemptions, and I know for a fact that the procurement ombudsman in his report on security exemptions wrote that in Canada, the NSE does not provide for an exception to full and open competition. Procuring bodies would require another reason to limit competition or to sole source procurement. Do you think the current national security exemptions that we have in place are adequate, or that they need to be updated as well when we're going through this DPU process, or as a committee doing this study right now on procurement?
I suspect they'd need to be, there may be some modifications that need to take place. And I know in Canada, sometimes in lieu of national security exception, we use the clause that's called not in the public interest. And this has been used before, but in very limited capacity. So that would probably need to be looked at as well, the use of that and in what conditions.
Okay, let's switch gears a little bit here and look at the ITBs, the industrial technical benefits. Do ITBs penalize Canadian industry from bidding on contracts? And does it increase the cost of procurement for the Government of Canada and ultimately for taxpayers?
Me?
Both of you.
Just checking.
Because the aerospace and the overall defense industry is impacted.
So I think there's a lot of confusion around the ITB regime. The ITB regime is a passive way of getting, it's a blunt instrument that is used to be able to get Canadian content or Canadian involvement within a procurement. So by nature, it shouldn't penalize Canadian firms. It should be a way in which we build domestic, we incentivize and build domestic capacity. And by the way, every country does this with its defense market. It is a managed market. We just choose to do it through a very passive tool instead of a more aggressive tool, which is absolute preferencing of your defense contractor prior to even a contract, an acquisition occurring. So I think that...
Mr. Mueller, would you agree with that, or would you say that Canadian companies have to pay, both they're already creating the product here, and then they have to get build the ITB as well? So you know, it's meant to originally, because if you're buying out of country, it ensures that there is some industrial benefits secured back in Canada. But a Canadian-based company, aren't they being penalized?
We see some circumstances where some companies are saying that. One of the things about the ITB process is often folks will say that's a strategy. And we keep saying that's not a strategy, that's a tool, and it's an after-the-fact tool. And so we need to take a look at how do we become maybe a little bit more proactive on some of these things? How are we driving the outcomes that make sense for the industry based in Canada across the board?